Hello, everyone. Today we'll be talking about authenticity or the art of being true to oneself. So let us begin. So the first basic question is, what is it to be authentic? What does authenticity mean? The basic slogan that I give you is something like being true to yourself. But that's a puzzling slogan. So one of the canonical ways of trying to say this is allegedly said by Oscar Wilde. It's something like, be yourself. Everyone else is taken. And the thought here is that to be authentic is to be unique. It's not to merely conform to others' expectations or something like that. But this only gets us halfway there, right? What if what you want to do is to imitate someone that you find admirable, right? If you there's this, soccer player, there's this great painter, there's this great thinker, that you think, oh, that person's wonderful. I want to be like them. Like if you think authenticity means being unique and different, then you might think that your mere desire to be like them makes you inauthentic. But that seems wrong. Like, why would that make you inauthentic? That's what you want to do, right? You want to be like them. So this kind of quick slogan doesn't tell us all that much. So we need to think more about it. So let's start with the notion of the self. To be authentic is to be true to oneself. What is this self that one is being true to when one is being authentic? Here's a general description. A self is something like collection of the identities and the narratives in which these identities figure. And these identities inform the understanding of ourselves and the way we navigate the world. So, for example, some of my identities are things like being male, being a father, being a husband, being a professor, being a philosopher, being Hispanic, and so on. Those labels are identities, are things I identify with. And they're not just labels, they are roles with the narratives that inform me about how I should think of myself, how I should navigate the world. But I mean, the more I keep adding these identities to myself, the more exhaustive they seem, and the more puzzling they seem. Because once we like give a full description of myself or any self as collection of all of these identities, then the claim "be true to yourself" seems to become trivial. So how can I not be true to myself if myself just is the totality of my identities? Even the kind of classical cases of being forced to do something, someone puts a gun to my head and says, "Hey, give me money or something." You might want to say that I'm being inauthentic when I'm forced to do something precisely because that's not what I really want to do, and yet it is it is the self who's complying with the threat, right? So there's a real sense in which the self, me, is doing the compliance with the threat. So, uh, what are we to make of this? Be true to yourself. And I think the first observation is that this exhaustive conception of the self is not the right starting point for authenticity because it covers too much. It covers everything. It covers all of the ways we see ourselves. It covers all of the actions we do. Everything we do, everything we think, even if there's a response to a threat, is something we do. So the conception of the self must be something narrower than this all-encompassing one. So there must be this thing called the real self or true self that is something like a subset of the whole description of your identities. In my particular case, I think closer to my true self are things like being a parent and being a philosopher. Those are, in some deep sense, more central to who I am than other peripheral things like being Hispanic. I am Hispanic, but it means less to me than being a philosopher and being a parent. And so there's this kind of hierarchy of identities, and closer to the heart are the true self. And then it makes sense to say, be authentic means act in such a way that you reflect the fundamental or central identities that define you, and not necessarily those that are closer to the outer layers of your identity, which many times are imposed upon you by other people. Right. So now I start to make sense of what it is to be authentic. But all sorts of questions arise if we make this distinction between the real self and the more general self. Things like, what is the role of social influence in our conception of ourselves and the conception of a true self? Are social influence necessarily pernicious to you? Do they are they problematic for our authenticity? Do they help? Or here are some other questions. Is being authentic something that is good for us? Is it valuable, or is it intention virtue? What if someone's true self, or at least part of the true self, is something like being a jerk? If they're authentic, then they act in a jerk-like fashion. But surely that's bad, right, for themselves and people around them. So it seems that at least in principle, the command, be true to yourself, may clash with the command, be a good person. What are we to make of those possible tensions? Those are real questions. Here are other relevant questions. Is how is authenticity, if it is at all, connected to things like doing well or succeeding or having a sense of fulfillment or being happy? Like all of those other notions we care about, they seem to be valuable and worth pursuing. How do they interact with being authentic? Do they interact with being authentic? So these are some of the basic questions in the kind of the literature of authenticity: what it is to be authentic, what it is to be true to yourself, and how those notions relate to others. Um, a good starting point is to actually formulate a clear notion of what it is to be authentic. And we should start with Rousseau, just because Rousseau is the father of authenticity. Rousseau himself never used the word authenticity to refer to what he was talking about. But before Rousseau, no one talked about being true to yourself. And after Rousseau, we all care about that precisely because he embodies the value of authenticity. And he thought it was, in some sense, the most important of all the values, prior to happiness, prior to virtue, prior to being the other considerations, but grounded in some deep sense. So let's look at Rousseau for a little bit. So Rousseau makes a distinction, like several other thinkers at his time, like Locke and Hobbes, but between people in the state of nature and people within society. And this distinction, theorists like Rousseau used to try to make sense of the legitimate authority of government. So within society, a society is defined as a group coming together with recognizable norms that guide their interactions, that guide their behavior, and typically with a governmental entity that ensures the compliance with those norms. And Rousseau himself wonders, why would one want to enter that kind of an arrangement? Why would one want to enter the society, given that it necessarily involves norms and then the body, governmental entity that informs those norms? So his first sentence, and he's very influential, the social contract, reads as follows: "Man is born free, and he is everywhere in chains." And his thought is that in the state of nature, that is a state of not being in a society, not being subject to the norms of people in societies, and especially a government that enforces those rules. He thinks that as a person in that state of nature, independent of society, is free. True freedom is to be found when one is not subject to any social expectations or norms. That's his starting point. And then he thinks being in chains just is being a part of a society. Society's norms and expectations and rules are necessarily oppressive to the freedom of the individual that enters society. So he thinks that any kind of social life, any kind of social expectation, any belief that other person might have upon you, any kind of expectation that other persons might lay upon you, is necessarily oppressive of the real self. So his conception of society is very sharp, it's very clear. What comes from social expectations is necessarily oppressive to who you truly are. And he points out something interesting. He says, social man lives always outside of himself. He knows how to live only in the opinion of others. So he's pointing out that we live in many ways very inauthentically. We know how to live, how to operate in the world through internalizing all of the expectations that people put upon us. So we know how to navigate the world because we have incorporated, internalized the narratives, the stories of our culture, and our role within those narratives and those structures, how we behave in the world on the basis of what the society tells us we should be doing. But he laments that fact. He thinks that that's a way of showing how enslaved we are to those norms, to those traditions, to those cultures. And we live outside of ourselves. We abandon our true origin, our true state in the state of nature for the sake of this superficial compliance with society. So he thinks that the opinion of others, any kind of social expectations, are necessarily opposed to the true self. And that's because those social expectations impose an idea, an identity, a self that is other than the natural one. The natural one is something like one's natural inclinations, biological preconditionings, things like that, and one's natural kind of like intellectual proclivities, or like the kinds of beliefs we're likely to hold. So our true self is the thing we're born with, our natural inclinations, our natural desires, our natural proclivities. That's the true self. And to the extent that society, expects us to behave in different ways, to that extent that is suppressing that natural self. So society is necessarily oppressive. So with that, we get a clear conception of authenticity. Authenticity is spontaneity. Spontaneity is acting how you feel like at the moment, because how you feel like at the moment is just what you were born with. There's the natural inclinations and passions and desires you were born with, in such a way that you don't take into consideration, you disregard any social expectations. You're being spontaneous when you act on the basis of how you feel like, independently of what people expect. And that's a source of originality and creativity. And all of those things are expressions of individuality. And that individuality is in opposition to, again, social expectations. To be authentic is to be an individual. To be an individual is to act spontaneously and originally. And to do that is to disregard any social expectations and to act on the basis of your inborn with kind of tendencies, your biological preconditionings, and things like that. So that gives you a very sharp conception of authenticity. Act in such a way that you ignore what anyone else says or thinks. The only thing that matters is what you think and what you feel. That's it. So that's a pretty clean conception of authenticity. It's worth noting that Rousseau thought that vice comes from people's true self being suppressed. The more we kind of are conforming to social expectations, the more we suppress our true self, our true desires, the more resentful we become with others, and the more likely we are to like hit them back and be vengeful, and like the bad feelings develop out of our frustration of our true self. And by contrast, if we're authentic, if we're original, if we're acting spontaneously, if we're doing those kinds of things, he thinks our moral consciousness will develop and our ability to act virtuously and well and be good members of society would actually increase by being authentic. We should be authentic first, and then the other cool things like happiness and virtue would follow from authenticity, because social expectations are necessarily oppressive. So anyway, that's a quick description of a extremely influential and the original conception of authenticity that Rousseau put forth. I do want to put some objections though. This conception of authenticity is deep at the American mind. The American mind, like it sounds right, but I want to bring to your attention a couple of objections to this way of thinking. And here's one of the important ones. He's just wrong. Rousseau is wrong about how virtue and vice develop. It turns out, if you do empirical studies, that good people, virtuous people, are formed by the community. And a different way of saying that is that if you're born with loving parents who are kind, who are benevolent, who are attentive, who nurture you, who help you develop and grow, you're significantly more likely to become a good person than if you grow up in an environment in which your parents are abusive and they attack you, they manipulate you, they mistreat you, and so on. It doesn't mean that your parents determine your future full stop, but it does mean that their influence is very important for your character development. Society is one of the things that is crucial for the development of virtue. Rousseau is wrong to think that society is necessarily oppressive. A different way of saying that is that society can, in fact, be good for us, provided that it's itself a good society. Here's the second kind of objection. So objection 1 and 2 are kind of different ways of saying the same thing. The third objection is a very different kind of objection, and in some sense, more fundamental objection. His conception of freedom, Rousseau's conception of freedom as individuality, as spontaneity on the basis of your biological preconditions, is mistaken, I think. Why? Because to act on the basis of one's inclinations is not itself an expression of true freedom. Rather, it seems to just be replacing one master, namely social expectations. If you just act because people told you to do so, yeah, he's right. Rousseau's right that you're not being true, you're not being free. But he's wrong in thinking that the alternative is to ignore everyone and just act how you feel like at the moment. Because how you feel like at the moment just is your biological preconditioning, right? Your prejudices, your biases, your genetic predispositions. And to a large extent, your unconscious absorbed societal conditionings. In other words, when you just act how you feel in the moment, you're just reflecting some other master, namely biology. You're not anymore free. You're just doing what biology wants you to do instead of what society wants you to do. In either case, you're just a passive object of someone else's agency, either nature or society. Now you might think, but wait a minute, those are the only two options. We act as a result of our biological preconditioning and our societal nurture environment. But that need not be the case. In fact, a lot of people think that's not the case. So for example, Aristotle thought that lower animals like bees and rats are in fact that way, right? So they have biological preconditionings, inclinations, instincts, and then they act in a kind of computer fashion, a pre-programmed fashion. There's a particular there's a particular stimulation, some external stimulation to the in the environment, and then the instincts kick in. And the instincts are just kind of a program running. They respond in given a particular stimulation. Humans, Aristotle pointed out, are not like that. We have a special thing, namely ability to think, which makes us stand above the biological preconditions. We can choose to not act on the basis of our inclinations. And Aristotle thought that is the source of our uniqueness. That is the source of humanity. And we can say that is the source of our authenticity. So authenticity for Aristotle could be, though he doesn't talk that way, but we can think about it that way. Mastery over one's actions. To be authentic is to take control over the entire shape of the project of your life. In allowing biology to do it is one way of not taking control. Allowing people or social expectations to do it is just another way of not taking control over your life. To be authentic is to take control over your life, to be master over your actions. So Aristotle thought that to be human is to perform the function distinctive of humanity, that is to think. So to think is to act on the basis of what he calls the distinctive activities of the soul. So thinking is the distinctive function or characteristic of humans, is the ability that the thing in virtue of which they can not merely be given into their biology, but crucially, it's also the thing that gives rise to your agency, is what makes you responsible for your actions. That a lion traces, a prey and eats it, and kills it and eats it. It's not something right or wrong, because the lion is just succumbing to their biological impulses, inclinations, and the lion cannot help it. You, however, can help it. When you get angry with a neighbor and you want to, shoot them, you are responsible because you have the capacity to reason, to think, to recognize that killing is bad, and thereby you can be held responsible for killing. Or if you do the right thing, you can be, praised for doing the right thing because you can recognize that it is right and act on the basis of it's being right. So you become a moral agent because you can reason, and then you can build things like moral character, virtues, loving relationships, and so on. And Aristotle thought that is what's distinctively good for humans. Um, so the real self for Aristotle is reason, but then we just grounded in reason. And then the authentic self is the self that is grounded in reason. So for you to be free, you must think about and deliberate about what to think and about what to do. And then to the extent that you take control over your thinking, you become a master of your own way of navigating the world and your own way of understanding yourself. And to that extent, you are being authentic, says Aristotle. Okay, well, I'll stop here. See you next time.